Sadashivasamarambham Shankaracharya Madhyamam Asmadacharya Paryantam Vande Guru Paramparam Om. So namaste everyone. We are joined here today by Aditi Banerjee, and Aditi is an important practicing attorney from New York. She did a bachelor's in international relations from Tufts University and also received a doctorate in law from Yale. She's also the co-author of the book Invading the Sacred and has published numerous other articles and essays, including Hindu Americans, an emerging identity in an increasingly hyphenated world. In spite of her qualifications, Aditi is a very modest and approachable person. And aside from being a dear friend, she's also quite the fierce warrior when it comes to defending Dharma. So, Aditi, it's a pleasure to be having this conversation. We briefly just touched upon some of your professional qualifications, but could you give us more insight into what it was like growing up as a Hindu in America? Did you encounter any cultural biases?
Sure. It was a very interesting experience growing up at the time I did in America. So on the positive side, I feel like growing up in America, the society and the school system here very much encourage you to explore and share your cultural identity and your religious identity. So oftentimes in classrooms, they would ask to share about my trips to India, to share about different Indian festivals and things like that. So that kind of environment is very helpful. And then the hard part, though, was being a Hindu with very little resources in terms of educating and educating, especially children, about what Hinduism is in a very simple kind of way that you could say in a 30-second or a 1-minute soundbite. So, for example, when my friends were asked about Christianity or Judaism or Islam, they could say something in 1 or 2 minutes that was very simple, that these are the 5 main things we believe in, this is what our holy books teach us. But as a Hindu, we were never really equipped to say these things. One, our parents and those in our community never taught us these things because growing up, they never had to describe or explain themselves that way. And then the other shortcoming was that even though I very much wanted to learn about Hinduism and the Hindu heritage, there weren't any good books in English that kind of spelled it out very easily. Sorry, I can't hear you.
Sorry. I meant on that note, could you also tell us more about how your personal journey as Hindu and how you got in touch with, I believe you may have had a guru at some point, and also what scriptures you started reading, because you're familiar with some of Swami Vivekanandaji's work as well, right?
Right. So, so from the time I was about 12 years old, I became very interested. What actually happened is my brother, once we were cleaning out my brother's room, and there was a small picture he had of Sri Krishna, and he didn't want that picture anymore. But when I saw it, I really wanted it, so I took it and I kept it in my room. And I didn't really know how to do puja or anything like that. But what I just started doing is I would take some incense in after my bath and wave it around the picture and read a chapter from Swami Vivekananda's works. So that was really how I started my journey. And then I used to go to the nearby Chinmaya mission for meditation classes, and I started taking yoga classes and things like that. Then when I was in college, I became very involved with the Hindu Students' Council, and in law school, I met my Guruji, and I formally received Diksha and things like that. And at that point, I started reading books on Vedanta and sadhana, and also books on Buddhism as well. So that's from that time on, I started my my sadhana in earnest. And also going on pilgrimages across India has been an important part of
You
that.
shared some beautiful photos of that.
Yes.
So did you grow up in a traditional family?
No, my family is actually very non-religious. So the main thing, once, maybe a few times a year, we would go to the temple. And as Bengalis, we would celebrate Durga Puja. But that was more of a cultural celebration than a very religious one. So my parents had a small shrine in their home, but religion wasn't a very big part of their lives.
I see. But there were no uncomfortable questions when you started doing pujas and nothing of that sort, right? there was a supportive environment for you to thrive in.
Yeah, so one thing that was interesting is that after I graduated from law school, when I started going to work, I wanted to wear a bindi every day to work. And my mother was very uncomfortable with that idea. She felt I would, stick out too much, um, and so she was a little bit nervous about that. But they've been very supportive of everything I've wanted to do and all of my trips and just my pujas and all of that. So they've been very helpful.
Yes, I see. Speaking of bindi, I noticed that you sport one all the time. And I recall in one of your talks or writings, you mentioned Jeffrey Kripal, one of the Indologists who refers to the bindi as indicative of menstrual blood. So, are such distortions that you hear about commonplace in the public psyche of Americans, or is it just some isolated comments that were made?
I have to say, I think it's. I've been very pleasantly surprised by the reception I've gotten just generally. Like in the workplace, a lot of times people will ask me just, what's the significance of it? Why do you wear it? And things like that. But it's always been with a very genuine curiosity and open-mindedness. So I haven't really encountered any biases or prejudice when it comes to, just comes to people. But I think it's just a virulent environment when it comes to the academy. So that's different, and that can also trickle down. But directly, I haven't faced anything negative.
I see. So this was around the time when you became aware of the problems created by the academy. Uh,
Yes, that started when I was in college, and I myself started taking some classes on Hinduism and South Asian studies, and I was very surprised by the types of things they were teaching. Even in high school, this actually happened, but in high school and then in college, I was very surprised by the very different way in which Hinduism was taught compared to the other religions, and all the biases, and that people weren't really speaking out against that.
could you please share a few examples?
Sure. So one example I remember in high school, I was taking an American history class, and my teacher one day brought in a newspaper clipping. That newspaper clipping was about this remote village on the coast of India, and this plane had landed, had gotten stranded there, and the villagers came out and rushed to garland the plane and the pilot, and so the teacher was saying, "Oh, look how silly these primitive people are. They're worshiping this white person as a god because they've never seen a white person before," and something along those lines. So this had no relevance, obviously, to our class, and I went to a very liberal school in a very an affluent middle class place where a lot of Asians lived. But it was very shocking that this kind of thing would be said in such a manner in the classroom. And at that time, because we're taught to be so respectful and deferential towards our teachers, so I didn't say anything at that time, but it really bothered me. And then there was another class I took on ancient history also in high school, and I can't remember the specific thing that my teacher had said about karma or reincarnation that was clearly wrong. And when I raised my hand to object, he said, he got very angry at me. He said, I've read 3 books on this topic, and why are you questioning me? Things like that. And then in college was when I came across for the first time this idea that Sri Ramakrishna had, sexually abused Swami Vivekananda and the other young monks in the Ramakrishna order. And hearing that in a classroom was just so shocking to me, and I couldn't understand where is this coming from, what's happening. And then when I first encountered Rajiv Malhotra and his works, then I started understanding that there's a pattern here, and there's a whole system that's producing this kind of misconception and distortions of dharma, and then it helped me kind of put things into context.
I see. So this is when the project for invading the sacred came into fruition. Once you met Rajiv ji.
Yeah, sometime after that, but at that time he was writing mostly on Sulekha, so everything was there in articles, and there was the start of this kind of this groundswell and this community movement. And then a few years after that, we realized that to really make an impact, you have to have things written in books and things like that. So that was kind of the genesis of the project.
I see. I want to return back to Invading the Sacred, but before that, I want to ask you about a work which I have not personally read. If you could just tell the audience about it, your essay on Hindu Americans.
Mm-hmm.
So, could you just give a brief overview of what it entails?
I think in that article, I was talking about the different types of identity that we have. So a lot of times we have this Indian American or South Asian American identity. And then my point in that article was that even more important than that identity for us in the long run will be our identity as Hindu Americans. Because many of us in this generation, our parents came from India. We still have these ties to India as a country, but in the generations to come, that ethnic or that racial connection will decrease. But what hopefully we will have will be the connection to the religious practices and dharma. And so therefore, uniting ourselves on that basis and not getting caught up in these regional or ethnic divisions is very important for our long-term interests in the West.
That's interesting, because how would you respond to a guy like Bobby Jindal, or Jindal as he likes to call himself, who who believes that Hindus or anybody else for that matter should not prefix their American identity with any other adjective?
I think that's the beauty of Hinduism, is that it adapts itself to whatever environment it's in. So, for example, when it went to Indonesia and Bali, it took on a different character that was compatible and consistent with the culture there. So it wasn't in any way disruptive, or it didn't ghettoize the Hindus there. It didn't alienate themselves from the rest of the community. And I think that's what, as Hindus, I think both sides of the hyphen are important. So we have to be Hindu, but we also can't, kind of cloister ourselves into staying the way India was in the 1960s or 1970s. We have to mainstream ourselves into American society and adopt the good values that we have here, and really play both sides of the hyphen in that sense. So I don't think being Hindu in any way takes away from being American, because I think the values of that are dear to America are also dear to us as Hindus.
I see. So you don't see too much of a difference in terms of value structure, ethics, perhaps as a cultural difference, but between Hindu Americans and Indians who are Hindus.
And there are differences. I think what's unique about America is it provides an environment where you as an individual can do anything that you want to do. And you can practice a lifestyle, you can practice a religion, you can get together with other community members in almost complete freedom. And so that allows you to live and evolve in this society. It's a very good nurturing environment in that sense. In some ways, I think it's easier to be Hindu in America today than it is to be in India. And so I think in that context, those values that allows that pluralism and that respect for others, and the ability to evolve in the way that's right for you and in accordance with your swadharma. And in that sense, they're good compatibilities.
Yes. I also completely agree with you about it being a lot easier to be a Hindu in the US, especially with the rise of pseudo secularism, and just there's a culture of shaming in India where a lot of rights that ought to belong to Hindus are stripped away, and in lieu of the minorities, because of minority appeasement and whatnot. So I'm actually, as you know, I grew up in India myself, and I moved to the US at the age of 18, and I was pleased to find that there's a lot of acceptance. As a Hindu, I did not feel that I was an outsider. I was made to feel at home in this country. So it's a very good nurturing ground for anyone's faith.
Right. And I think also people here are genuinely very open and welcoming. As long as you're confident and have self-respect, others also respect you and embrace you. So that's also another great thing here.
Do you see any shortcomings that Hindus face in the US?
I think the shortcomings that we face are all of our own doing. So I think no one gives you anything for free. So you have to stand up and be counted. You have to work to get your rights and things like that. But once you do and once you ask for that, I think the system here is very responsive. But I feel that other minority groups, including the Sikhs, the Buddhists, Muslims, have been much more coordinated and activist and unified in representing their interests and in furthering their own agendas. But we as Hindus have, first of all, not even been willing to call ourselves Hindu, let alone figure out what it is our identity is as Hindus and what our agenda should be and how we should come together to work for that. So I think that's really our shortcoming versus the shortcomings of America itself.
I see. That makes a whole lot of sense, especially the name changes. So, I have a friend, Pratik, who became Patrick, and I never quite figured it out why. So, I wanted to return back to Invading the Sacred. And so I just wanted to understand, because there were several other co-authors as well. And so how did you all decide to collude upon this project, to work on it, and how did it come about in the final form?
So I actually joined the project a little bit later on than after the other co-authors had been engaged. But the way that we worked together on it was we each had a few different chapters or a few different sections we were primarily responsible for. And then we'd work on that piece, kind of share it with the others, get everyone's comments and things like and things like that. Um, I think what was very exciting about it was really the first time this kind of book was being put together, and all of us felt the urgency, I think, of having something that's published as a book that can be there as a reference for others. And a lot of what we went through was how do we frame it, and even for example, so the subtitle of the book is so it's Invading the Sacred: An Analysis of Hinduism Studies in American Universities. So we went through a lot of back and forth about whether to even include the word Hinduism in the title. So for example, if you're thinking about trying to appeal to an Indian audience, they may want something like Indic studies or something more generic. But the question of who are we appealing to? Who was the target audience? Should it be, Hindus? Should we just call it out as that, or how to frame it? Things like that. So there's a lot of interesting discussions we had on that.
I see. So, what were some of the sections that you dealt with?
So a lot of the sections that I dealt with were on, for example, how you had something like Kortright, Paul Kortright from Emory University, who compared Ganesha's trunk to lymph phallus and said that he
He's a
was.
local menace, by the way.
Oh, I'm sure. And then so kind of taking this Freudian analysis towards our shastras and our devas. And then what was very interesting, because I'd actually experienced this firsthand, is so you think there's this guy who wrote this book. It's something arcane. First of all, he got like I forget now the exact title. He got an award for that book, like the best religious book of the year, or something like that. And then what was interesting is there was a museum exhibit in Washington D.C., I believe, that had statues of Ganesh. And one of like the postcards or the placards in that exhibit, and this is an exhibit children were going to, actually carried Kortright's interpretation of Ganesha's trunk and his penis envy of Shiva and things like that. So so the fact that you have something that starts from the ivory tower but then enters into mainstream popular consciousness and kind of tracing that pattern. So that was one of the things I looked at, and just the overall kind of community responses to that and how that movement kind of grew.
Okay. So, aside from Doniger, Kortright, who are some of these other thought leaders who inform the academy and just go about the business distorting our shastras? So, are there any other?
So Jeffrey Kripal was there. Who he was the one who wrote the most about about the Ramakrishna mission and his homoerotic tendencies and how that influenced Swami Vivekananda and things like that. Then there's Sarah Caldwell, who wrote about like the bloodthirsty goddesses and things like that. So there are a number of these people who are affiliated with Wendy Doniger. And what was interesting is a number of them started off what I would say being very sincere and earnest. So when they went to India for their fieldwork, for example, they either had an interest in Hinduism or were practicing it in some sense or the other. And then what happens is what's interesting is the U-turn that subsequently gets made, where they start with positive scholarship, oftentimes get embraced by the community, but then suddenly do this U-turn where they find these very negative, biased readings that kind of come out of nowhere. So that was an interesting thing. And then another was, Gordon White, I believe, who wrote about tantra and things like that. So there were a number of them, but they kind of all would reference each other. They were all connected to Wendy Doniger in one way or the other. And I think what's interesting now is, so you had that kind of school of Indologists and people studying Hinduism, and now shifting to some of the more recent controversies over Sheldon Pollock and things like that, which represent kind of like a new wave of Indologists in a certain sense.
So when you speak about U-turn, in your opinion, is this intentional or is it accidental, or do they just happen to suddenly start focusing on the negatives?
I think it's I think there are a few different forces at play. One is on a personal level, there's some sense of maybe like inability to completely digest, because a lot of times it's a very rapid interest that they have in Hinduism. And sometimes it comes from wanting to rebel against whatever tradition they were growing up themselves. So sometimes the reasons that brought them to Hinduism aren't necessarily the most genuine or long lasting, or there's some other problems there. And so then they're very quick to kind of pivot away from that. Then I think another is that just the very nature of the academic system itself in the West, especially when it comes to Hinduism and Indology, you're very much encouraged to keep a distance from Hinduism, from Indology, to not, in a sense, go native, because that would corrupt your objectivity and things like that. So I think there's also immense pressure on them to find these negative, sensationalist readings, because it makes their work sell more, it makes them more interesting, and it helps them kind of, further their careers in Indology. So I think all of these forces kind of operate together to produce this type of result.
I see. I would also like to add that the concept of adhikartvam comes into play over here, because a lot of these scholars were not adhikaris to begin with. And so they
Yes.
assumed that they can take the mantle of Hindu studies upon themselves when they may not have had the right sort of qualification from the traditional standpoint.
That's an extremely important point. So I think one is that they presume that they're qualified, even though those within our tradition would say they actually don't have any qualification at all to speak of these things. And because they don't have that, that inner purity or those practices. So in our tradition, you can't just read a book or read a shastra and then be considered a master of it. You have to undergo certain preliminary practices and spiritual practices to be able to hold that knowledge within yourself. And so in the absence of that, then you're also liable to make very wrong interpretations and readings out of that.
That makes sense, yeah. So once Invading the Sacred came out, it was published. What kind of impact did it have? Did it ruffle some feathers? Did it prompt the academy to redraw their army lines and strike back?
I think there were definitely attempts to discredit the book and make it about this Hindutva, right-wing fanaticism, that kind of thing. But I think it even though that was there, I think the overwhelming impact of it was very positive. So a number of schools adopted it into their curriculum.
Oh, really?
So some colleges for their students. So I think even where there were professors who may not have totally agreed with everything in the book, they recognized that it was an important project, and so they felt that their students should also have exposure to it. And then I think just across the community, it had a lot of impact. People read it, and I think just bringing together what otherwise could be a lot of isolated examples and showing how they're all connected together, and there's this, the syndrome that we're facing, and especially for people in college as a way of equipping them and preparing them for what they're about to face. So I think it was very important from that perspective.
I see. Did you see an increase in publications from the academy following this? Did they start, you talked about a few general criticisms, but I also see that there's been a lot of impact in terms of somebody like Pollock. I think, at least as far as the average Indian goes, he was more or less unknown a year and a half ago. But now he's come into the news with the endorsement of this Rohan Murthy guy. So how do you, what message do you have for the general public? Because I'm sure there is no dearth of intellectuals amongst Hindus, and yet we have this tendency to keep going towards the perceived scholar from the West.
Right. I think that's one of the important parts for invading the sacred too, was because, especially with our culture, we start with this automatic deference towards teachers, towards scholars, and especially someone who has a PhD. We just assume that they must know something, and even when we may not know very much, we think we should give them the benefit of the doubt. And even if we have doubts, we consider it very rude to openly challenge them. Combining that with the fact that we're emerging from colonialism, and we have this kind of inferiority complex towards those in the West or towards whites, I think it's created this very unlevel playing field where where they kind of went on unchallenged in a certain sense with whatever scholarship that they wanted to do. I think having I think the work around invading the sacred, the work Reggie Mulhilton and others did, it kind of gave us permission to fight back, in a sense, to say that just having a title and just being a professor at a university doesn't qualify you to make these sweeping categorizations of our culture. And so then I think there's more of a willingness to take on these types of scholars, and so therefore I think that kind of equipped us to take a look at Sheldon Pollock, who's been given so many awards, and including by India, and say, but that doesn't mean that he's right, and that doesn't mean his work should be supported and funded by us.
Has there been any change in American universities where they are more open and accepting to Hindus being practicing Hindus as opposed to just scholars? So, for instance, just to give you an example, a few weeks back, I was approached by somebody, part of an interfaith dialogue, and they wanted me to just share a few thoughts on Sanatana Dharma. And so I was happy to oblige and be a part of it. But then they later told me that I have to speak about myself as a Hindu in third person. Say that the Hindus believe in this, not I believe in this, so this is what I follow. And furthermore, they would even keep a presentation ready for myself. So I have to basically just read out of everything that they have ready for me, whether I agree with it or not.
Really?
So yeah, and I found that extremely disturbing. So of course I declined. And I just wanted to understand, because I see that there's a strong hegemony in the West where there's a narrative being formed about India, and the narrative is controlled by Westerners. So do you see any of this opening up to Hindus, or is it still just as bad as it was earlier?
I think it's a little bit better in certain senses. I think people are more careful of not being so overtly anti-Hindu. So I think, for example, when you read some of the very, sensationalist or rude things Wendy Donegal would say, for example, saying that the Mahabharata is about genocide, Krishna wanted genocide, and the Gita is a dishonest book, things like that. I think you would be hard pressed to find scholars making exactly those types of statements nowadays, or at least there's less of that. But I think the fundamentals of the situation haven't changed. So I think when a Hindu wants to be assertive and defend his or her tradition, there's still a lot of resistance that they come up against. I think some of the recent events we've seen about initiatives to try to establish chairs and things like that, and the type of response that the academy has put forth shows that there's still extremely high obstacles for us.
And it also seems hypocritical, because they are more than happy to cry about freedom of speech when it it comes to banning Wendy's book in India. I think there was a
Right.
huge hue and cry about it, but they are doing the same thing when somebody's trying to establish a chair over here. Not that I agree with it wholeheartedly, but just the principle that I'm against them having control over something that they don't have adhikar over.
Right, and also it's an astonishing double standard. So these same universities take tens of millions of dollars from the Saudis to establish different Islamic studies, centers for Islamic studies and things like that, being funded by Saudi princes, and they have no compunction about taking their money. But just because some individual may donate who may have some distant connection to the RSS, that somehow is poison. So it's just like a very shocking double standard that makes absolutely no sense.
Yes. So aside from yourself, Rajiv Ji, and a few other well-known individuals who are working along this front, who are some of the others who may not be so much in the public eye, who are leading the charge, and we should just know about them?
So I think there's been a lot of people doing a lot of good work on textbooks, for example. So there's Rakesh Bahadur in Virginia. So a number of years ago, there were a lot of problems with the primary school textbooks, and these are all done differently through different states. So it's all very local. And so there are problems in terms of how they described India and Hinduism, and things about the Aryan invasion theory, things about caste and sati and dowry, things like that. So he had kind of very quietly done a lot of hard work to get these textbooks changed in Virginia, and he was successful. And he didn't set about to make a lot of PR about himself, but he did a lot of effective work on that. So he was very good. Then I think people like Vishal Agarwal, who's an extraordinarily good scholar, and he put together a very detailed, almost page by page um, analysis and rebuttal of Wendy Doniger's book, An Alternative History of the Hindus. And he's done, just a tremendous amount of work of the kind of point by point scholarship against Kortright and Doniger and things like that. So he's someone else who comes to mind. And I think what's really surprising is there's so many people in the community who do this in their free time. So this isn't the way that they earn their money, but on their free time, in the evenings and the weekends, they do this. And when you compare that to other groups like like Muslims or Jews who have institutions, who have the resources to have like full-time careers devoted to this. And then when you see for the people on our side who are really committed and who care about this, but who just put in their own time and funds into this, I think that's really remarkable.
That's a really good observation. I didn't think about it earlier. What do you think is the cause of this? Do we lack the funding, or is there not enough of an aptitude for traditional scholars to take up an academic position?
I think historically there are a few things. One is that so many of our traditional institutions were just destroyed through the colonial era, and um, sorry about that. So can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so many of our traditional institutions, like our pathshalas, were destroyed through colonialism, and so we lost that infrastructure by which we learn and defend and propagate our traditions. And I think also the other thing is, in a sense, we were never a organized or centrally organized religion. So we never had anything like the Vatican or formal institutions, or who are meant to speak for all Hindus as one. So everything was by different sampradayas and paramparas, which is very good because in a way that allows for so much diversity and so much you follow your own path and you don't really bother about what others are doing. So it's a very good thing and very special thing about Hinduism, that we have this flowering of different sampradayas and paramparas, and no one tries to assert dominance over the rest. But I think the flip side of that is we also don't have any bodies that speak for Hinduism or the Hindu society as a whole. I think the one great exception to that was the Hindu Acharya Sabha that Swami Dayananda Saraswati ji had established, and that's like a very remarkable achievement. But other than that, we don't have institutions, and so because we didn't have that kind of growing up, I think in our minds we don't have that familiarity with kind of working in an institutional setting or working in strong organizations. And I think we have to our opponents are always, even when they have differences of views amongst themselves, they're always able to come together and stand united and put on a common front. And I think we have to learn to do that. Instead, when we do try to come together, we just get we get divided over little issues that aren't relevant to the main fight that we face. So theological or metaphysical differences, which don't really come into play, because the issues that we face as Hindus are common to all of us, regardless of whether we're Advaita, Dvaita, whichever darshana or whichever sampradaya we're from.
That's so true. Absolutely. I wanted to go back on one point you made about Wendy Doniger, right? So she's made several wrong remarks about the Shastras, such as the Gita being a dishonest book, and um, just saying wrong things about Rama's character and whatnot. So one would wonder if there's and this might sound controversial, but is there a concerted effort? Is it almost like an intentional thing that they're doing? Is there some missionary backing involved over here? Like, because it seems very strange that so many academics would come together to say the same nasty things which no Hindu would have thought about in 1,000 years or 1,000,000 years, but still they come to the same rotten conclusions. So there seems to be more of a more at hand behind all of this.
Right. I mean, I think here we have to be a little bit careful. So someone like Wendy Doniger, for example, who's she's Jewish but not particularly like devoutly Jewish, and someone like Sheldon Pollock, who's who's a Marxist, and so they, for example, wouldn't have a missionary agenda. But what happens is there are definitely forces who are out there that missionary forces that are pouring a lot of funds into India and into NGOs that want to break India, that want to antagonize Hinduism, and they capitalize off of these scholars. And sometimes there is a nexus between some of them, but I think when you have, even if they're not working together, they end up kind of inadvertently operating together. There's like a nexus of different forces that we're facing. So the missionary agenda of defaming Hinduism, and what kind of drove Indology in the 1800s and the 1700s, for example, when Max Muller and William Jones were there. They wanted to understand Hinduism in order to dismantle its power, to allow the East India Company and to allow Britain to take over. So there was a very definite economic and missionary motivation there that drove Indology at that time period. And now I think some of the things may have changed. So for example, when Sheldon Pollock is looking at Hinduism, he's looking at it through a Marxist lens, which is that Sanskrit and our Samskriti can't have like any sacred power, because in a Marxist worldview there is nothing that's sacred. Everything is materialistic, and so therefore everything he views the Ramayana, he views Sanskrit through this very political lens. How is Sanskrit used to oppress the Dalits and oppress women and things like that? So he brings that kind of framework to it. So I think you have all of this happening, and then I think, why is Hinduism kind of fair game for these scholars when they're much more careful about Islam or Buddhism or Sikhism? So one, I think that's an interesting question. I think one is that there's just so much of the Muslims are so much more mobilized that if they tried to say something against Islam, the repercussions would be so immediate and strong that they wouldn't dare to do it. So that's part of it, is a lack of mobilization on our end. But I think the other thing is so many of the times Hinduism kind of gets relegated to being mythology or being an ancient kind of dead tradition, kind of like what the Greeks or the Romans or the Egyptians had. And it's kind of seemed like you can just kind of play around with it. These are fun things without realizing you're hurting the sentiments of, of over 1 billion people for whom Hinduism is a very living and vibrant tradition. And so I think we have to be very careful to not call our Puranas, our Vedas, mythology, and that these are very real and living to us. So I think that also kind of gives them a license to play around with this. And then I think there are just so many of the biases that are residual from the colonial times, where we're just painted and viewed as being very primitive, tribal, bloodthirsty. Like there was that Indiana Jones movie that showed
I was just going to say that.
that show us like eating monkey brains and things like that. So that's still so embedded in people's minds that I think they just have a hard time moving away from that kind of stereotype. And so they just think we're primitive, bloodthirsty people, and then they just view us through that prism.
And as you say, once people start talking about such a narrative in the academia, it starts moving out into the public discourse, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's where they get these ideas from, for Temple of Doom and whatnot.
Right.
And they would dare not make such a movie for any other faith.
Yes.
I wanted to ask, what are some of the current projects and future projects that you would like to be involved in?
So right now, there's I think this controversy over Sheldon Pollock and all of this is very important. So I think the whole idea of who controls our studies of Sanskrit and Samskriti, and I think Sheldon Pollock is very interesting. I think he's in many ways more insidious and dangerous than someone like Wendy Doniger, and that's for the reason that he's so embraced and adored by our own people in India. And so the very fact that the Murthy Classical Library of Indian texts, which was established by Narayan Murthy and his family from Infosys, and that he was selected to be the general editor. So he appeals to Indians, or to many Indians, obviously in certain ways. But the fact that he brings these biases into his readings, and kind of the long-term impact that this could have on our culture, because if this project to translate 500 of our classics into English over the next several years, in the generations to come, these are the books we're meant to be reading. These are how we're going to be informing ourselves of what our tradition and our history is. And who do we give that power to? Someone who has this negative view of us, who doesn't even believe that there's anything sacred in our traditions. Should we give custodianship of our civilization to people like that? So that's, I think, one side of the problem. And then you have others like Devdutt Patnaik, who's not a scholar in a certain sense, but he writes these kind of popular books that are in the beginning, I actually enjoyed reading some of his books where he does like retellings of stories from the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, and different stories that many of us are not necessarily familiar with. But the danger of that is, because so many of us haven't read the primary sources, so many of us haven't read the Valmiki Ramayana ourselves. When he takes liberties with the text and in terms of how he retells it, we think, oh, that's the real version. And now there are a lot of negative things that he's bringing into it. So, for example, he had an article about how Sri Krishna was a bad father, the things of that nature, how the Ramayana was patriarchal, and now there's a serial going on in Star Plus TV where he's the chief creative consultant, and so they have things of just a lot of like nonsense in there about Sita stopping the Ashwamedha Yagya, and how there was so much casteism and things like that. So all of this nonsense is coming in. So as we have a more and more of a public that's uneducated about our own about our Puranas and Itihas and our Devas, then more people like this can come in and just kind of foster these totally wrong notions and ideas of what our of what our religious tradition actually is. So I think this is going to be like the big danger that we face. And so I think, in a sense, in addition to the work that has to be done on the academic front, I think what I feel is a lot has to be done on the popular front. So by that I mean things like in the creative arts. So like in terms of novels or TV serials or movies that kind of depict our tradition in positive, authentic ways. And then that's kind of one of the things I want to focus on in the next few years for myself, in terms of bringing our traditions into the more, you know, because I think it's just unrealistic to think that people are going to read the original text, but to do retellings that are authentic and more geared towards a mainstream audience.
Yes, that makes sense. Speaking of Deval Patnaik, first of all, I have issues with him presenting himself as a mythologist, whatever that's supposed to mean.
Right.
And I've seen that he has catered to the Doniger's perspective about just dividing the world into twos, and it's either this interpretation or that interpretation. But
Mhm.
he's almost allergic to give the original interpretation of what the Shastras present. So he's trying to present every single other view except what's presented in the teaching, in the tradition. And we see a rise of authors such as him. I'm not dissing Amish Tripathi because I've not read his books, but then there's Amish Tripathi, there's Devdutt Patnaik, and we see a whole spate of such authors. And yet at the same time, we see there are so many compelling books written by Swami Vivekananda ji, even by my guru Pūjya Swāmiji Dayananda ji, and so many others. So what, according to you, is driving the common public towards these mythologists as opposed to studying from traditional gurus?
I think some of it is there are a few different things. One is like Swami Vivekananda and Swami Dayananda Saraswati, for example, are some of the few who have books available in English. But a lot of our other important shastras, for example, there aren't good English translations of. So for example, even the Mahabharata, like the full unabridged Mahabharata, there isn't a good English translation of that available. The closest is one it's nearing, I don't think it's complete yet, by Vivek Debroy. That's good, but again, it's not from like that's still in progress. But for example, like for like the Vedas and other things, we don't have good translations. So that's part of it. One is the lack of good materials in English for many readers. Then the other is, I think, unfortunately, there's a lot of laziness. So people don't want to invest. Like the full Ramayana is actually available online at I think it's like valmikiramayan.net or something. So they have like the English translations, very well done. But people don't want to invest the time and effort to read it. They want something that's very quick and easy. Their attention spans are short, so they want something they can read on a Facebook post, like a quick YouTube video or something, very quick and easy, and they can just get the point and go on. So one is having a supply of those types of materials. Then the other is that we're so brainwashed. So I think we've really bought into the propaganda that the Ramayana is misogynistic, that our texts are all patriarchal and casteist, and why should we read these things? These aren't applicable to us, and we should just live how we want to live and follow our hearts, things like that. So there's so much of this brainwashing and propaganda that we've bought into that we don't even have that shraddha that these are holy things, that it's good for us, that's for our benefit and part of our duty to read and study. So I think there's a combination of all of that. So like I know, like my good friend growing up was a Muslim, and when she was young, she didn't really want to read the Quran, but her father said, no, you have to, and then she read it, and for her it was like she still had so much conviction in it, that this is something I have to do, this is something I have faith in, and there's just a basic reverence for it that Hindus don't at all have for their own tradition. No one has this sense that, yes, I must read the Gita, or I must know the Ramayana or the Mahabharata, or I must do some small puja. There's just none of that. Like Muslims in America are very fastidious about doing the Ramadan fasting, but Hindus, when it's Shivratri, it's like, oh, if it's a work day, I have to go to work tomorrow, so I'll just skip it, and things like that. So those kind of lax attitudes that we have towards our dharma and our traditions. That's kind of infecting all of this too.
There's also that attitude of everything goes that's associated with Sanatana Dharma.
Yes.
So, Aditi, I wanted to ask one final question, and I think it's an important one which has been on my mind for the last few weeks. We see that there's definitely, at least on the internet, there's a growth in interest in Hindu matters. But at the same time, we see an alarming rise in emotional responses and immaturity among our own people.
Mm-hmm.
So what solutions would you propose to check that?
Yes, I think, there's so there are a few things. One is just, it's just like an immediate knee-jerk thing. It's easier to just, to call someone names rather than come up with a thoughtful response. So there's some of that knee-jerk kind of emotional response, or this kind of armchair activism that's bad. And I think there's also, we have to do our homework too. So, so I think there's this idea of saying that, for example, just saying Pollock is evil, so we're just gonna, like vilify him. That's not helpful. Like, we have to do our homework of actually, reading what he says, studying him, as Rajiv Malhotra did, and then, putting together a thoughtful response and something that's based on, I think too often we're personality based rather than principle based, and it cuts both ways. One is we demonize someone just based on who they are without really going through the positions and coming up with cogent arguments. And the flip side of that is we kind of do blind hero worship and say, if someone said something, without even considering the merits of what they said, we have to support them. And it's just easy sometimes to just think of everything as teams, like these are the good guys, these are the bad guys. And that's intellectually dishonest, and that's laziness, and that'll hurt us over the long term. So I think we have to be thoughtful, we have to engage in terms of principle, and we can't just make everything he's personality based in a sense.
Yes, and I think one of the things our gurus have also encouraged is to build upon their work as opposed to just imitation. And so I see a lot of Hindus, they're just very complacent about it, and they are comfortable just being second-rate imitators, but they don't have the due diligence, put in the due diligence, or even have the interest to build up on their predecessors. And I think that's lacking in our narrative.
Right. And I think also, this kind of copy paste idea, that doesn't work. And then also, what you said is in terms of building on their work. So one is that, our whole tradition is based on context. So, or situational dharma. So you can't look at something that someone else said and just apply that wholesale. You have to figure out what was the context in which it was said, and what is the context in which I'm operating in right now, and how should that be adapted, if at all, to make sense in the present context. So we shouldn't become, in a sense, like fundamentalist or literalist when it comes to things, for example, that Swami Vivekananda said or other people said, and just and look at it through that frame. We have to I don't want to say, think for ourselves, because we also have to have the reverence for what our acharyas and what our tradition and what the shastras say. So it's not that anything goes, but there has to be a thoughtfulness there, and that's sorely lacking on our end.
Yes, as long as you have the right sort of vivekaha, then you can analyze everything against your own intellect, and it acts as a filter. So I definitely hope that we see more of that. And on that note, I want to thank you for allowing me to conduct this interview. You've been wonderful as always, and hope to have more of these as time goes on.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks a lot. Would you like to close with a prayer of your choice? Just it doesn't matter, whichever.
I'll leave it to. I would like to. I'll leave it to you.
Okay. Om Purnamadah Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnameva Vashishyate Om Shanti 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 Harih Om Shri Gurubhyo Namaha Harih Om